And Cory, did you already test to see that the captioning is working?
I did. I can test again. Testing,
great.
testing. 1, 2, 3.
Awesome.
There.
Perfect.
Cool.
Okay, so we are now live on YouTube on an unlisted channel. And I am going to, I can hear it. Can someone make me the host again?
You should be the host.
I am. Why won't it also let me record to it? Okay, well, as long as just checking on the live feed. Okay. Just gonna make it full screen real quick. Okay, cool. So we're also recording now. And you guys ready to get started? Cool. So hi, everyone. I am Danielle Blunt. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with Hacking Hustling, a collective of sex workers and accomplices working at the intersections of tech and social justice to interrupt state surveillance and violence that's facilitated by technology. And this is our legal literacy panel, which I'm super excited about. Just a few housekeeping notes. We have closed captioning, and if you don't see it on your screen and would like to, you can right click on the ... more, the closed captioning, and turn them on. And I'll put that into the chat in just a second. If you want to use the Q&A function, please, we encourage you to do so. I'll be monitoring the chat as well. But if at any point we use any language or acronyms or bill numbers that you have no idea what the fuck we're talking about, please, please, please let us know. This is for you, and we want to make sure that it's accessible for you. So if you need us to slow down or clarify anything, please feel free to ask questions throughout the conversation. Yeah, so do we feel good to get started? Do we want to go around and do introductions first? Okay, great.
I can go. Hi, everybody. My name is Kendra Albert. I'm an attorney and obliged to say via that none of this is legal advice. I work at the Harvard Cyber Law Clinic as a clinical instructor there, and also do some work with Hacking Hustling. And my pronouns are they, them. And I'm super, super excited to be here and be in conversation with y'all.
Hi, I'm Eves. I use they and she pronouns, and I am an organizer with Survived and Punished New York, which is an abolitionist group based in New York around eradicating the criminalization of survivors of gender-based and sexual violence. And I'm also an organizer with Red Canary Song, which is a sex work organizing group also based in New York, mainly focusing around supporting migrant sex workers.
Hi, I'm Cory Kizaemon. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a law student at Cornell in my third year. And I originally got started with sex workers' rights when I was in Seattle, and I worked for a nonprofit called Legal Voice. And I also was involved through a clinic at Cornell called the Gender Justice Clinic. And so I'm excited to be here today and talk to you all more about the subject.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lorelei. I'm an activist and I work with Red Canary Song as well as Hacking Hustling, and have worked with these folks on issues of surveillance and tech-related violence that's impacting people in the sex trades for the last few years. So I'm really excited to be in conversation as well.
Awesome. And Eves, do you want to kick it off with a little like community report back, that would be a great place to start.
Hi, so yeah, I'm just gonna kind of talk about like a little bit about how we got here, and then a little bit about how it's affected mainly the sex working community, but also in general. So what we're mainly talking about, or what I'll mainly be talking about, is around contact tracing and public health, like uses for surveillance, and then also SESTA, FOSTA, and the EARN IT bills. So these things all have increased the scope of policing. And when I say policing, I don't just mean the police department, but also through citizen surveillance and like deputizing not only just like people, but also deputizing like non-police department agencies and companies, right? This includes a lot of different people, and this really like increases the scope of policing and criminalization in a way that it wasn't previously. And the way that this has happened is like structural violence that has led to so much harm to already marginalized and stigmatized communities. So kind of the reason why this is like happening the way that it is because a lot of the conversation around surveillance like belies like powerful moralism that resist against like evidence and logic. We see this like happening like post 9/11, where you get this idea of like, if you see something, say something, which sort of creates these like hyper vigilant crusaders for both like anti-terrorism, but also like anti-trafficking, which is also often an issue that is tied up with sex work, right? So when we see this happening, the surveillance is increased in such a way that we've seen this happen before. Like this predates all of these sorts of things, right? They've used contact tracing before to criminalize different marginalized communities and sex working communities for a really long time, in which they have like with HIV AIDS, we see as an example, right? They ask you when you get tested for HIV, have also criminalized the spread of HIV, period, right? But when you go into a clinic and you are asked, you're going to be asked if you test positive or if you think that you have any STI, right? Especially HIV AIDS, they're going to say, who have you had sex with? Like, name those people. In like what time frame did you have sex with those people? We want to contact those people. How do we get in contact with them, right? Whether that's like from someone indirectly from you or from you yourself when you go in to get tested, right? They're like getting this information. And the truth is that information doesn't just stay at the health clinic, doesn't just stay where you think it stays, right? That information gets passed on to the police. That information gets passed on to these different agencies like CPS, right? And that leads to the criminalization of a lot of people, not just sex working people, right? Also people who are profiled as sex workers. And so they use that information to be like, oh, you're like selling sex. So then like the cops are going to come knocking on your door. And this similarly happens with COVID, right? So when we're seeing what's happening with COVID, when they use contact tracing in a very similar way, and also if you've seen the public rhetoric around this, right, the way that like health officials are talking about it, the way that government officials are talking about it, they say that sex workers are high risk people, right, to have COVID. So then if you are working in a massage parlor, if you're working on the street and you come in to get tested for COVID, they're going to be like, oh, how did you get in contact? How did you get this? Like, who were you in contact with? Or like if someone that you know has COVID and they go to get tested and they get COVID, right, they're going to be like, how did you get this? Who are you in contact with? And then you tell them, oh, I went to this massage parlor. Oh, I like met this person on the street. That's just a way of criminalization, because the truth is that they are not just out to treat you, right? They're going to like turn over that information to the police. And this happens to like spread the scope of like policing in so many different ways, not just in the sex working community, right? In a lot of different communities, they use these exact same surveillance techniques. We should think of like surveillance as a strategy that exists within the larger frame of policing to police a lot of different people. We also see the way that people talk about like contact tracing these different methods of surveillance as ways of policing other marginalized communities that are not sex working, right? But we know that a lot of marginalized people are sex workers anyway. But like we see the talk of this being expanded to also surveil protesters recently. We see this like talking about surveilling a lot of different communities in this way of being like, oh, how did you get this? Oh, you were at a protest last week? Oh, who were you around? Like, who was there? This all happens in that same sort of scope. And it happens in all of these different agencies that have then been deputized, right? And similarly happens when you have these situations with SESTA and FOSTA and EARN IT. You know, these are not directly, we wouldn't necessarily directly think of them as surveillance, because we think like, oh, they're censoring, they're taking down these sites, then that is like not directly surveillance, but it's not actually true. A lot of these bills are also like collecting information, right? Because they're putting these sorts of laws in place to go against sex trafficking. And so they tell you, these are the indicators of sex trafficking, look for these indicators, but really those indicators aren't indicators of sex trafficking most of the time, and are also like spread out to sex workers and other people, and people who are profiled as sex workers. So like it's also like a lot of data collection that is happening in order for them to censor, shadow ban, and do all of these things anyways, right? And that data is also getting turned over to the police to be used. But also we like generally see the like kind of attack that happens to sex work coming in from all ends, where like, so SESTA and FOSTA, we saw this, right? Like this is just what happened already. People are pushed to work in more dangerous ways because you can't go on Backpage, you can't go on Craigslist.
Can I stop
like,
you for one
of course.
1 sec? Okay, that was amazing. Thank you so much for that. I just want to take a moment to ask for definitions on what is contact tracing, and just like anyone who wants to jump in, a 1-sentence summary of FOSTA, SESTA, and EARN IT, just so folks are on the same page from this forefront.
Well, I can like expand a little bit on contact tracing, right? So when an epidemic occurs, right, which I brought up HIV/AIDS, how they kind of figure out who might have it so that they can treat them, right? In the best case scenario, this information would not be used to police people, right? But that's not what happens. But like contact tracing is when they try to figure out who has had it, or like who gave it to you, and like, or who you could have possibly given it to, right, in order to treat those people or to stop the spread, so that you can get those people into treatment centers or to get treatment. So if I, for example, right, were to go into a clinic and I was like, I have chlamydia, right? So then they're like, okay, so you have chlamydia. Who did you have sex with before this? Who did you have sex with after you thought you might have shown symptoms? And then you like list them off, like, okay, I saw Blunt, I saw Kendra, I saw Lorelai, I saw all these people, right? And you list them off, and then they're like, oh, did that person tell you that they have chlamydia? Did that person tell you that they have HIV/AIDS? Da 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 da. Right? We see the criminalization of HIV/AIDS is like similarly with the like criminalization that's happened with COVID, where they're criminalizing directly the spread of COVID and HIV, but also generally, right? They use this information to be like, oh, who did you get this from? And ideally, they wouldn't police people, but what ends up happening is they ask you all this information, and then they kind of pick out those indicators to be like, you're a sex worker, like you're selling sex, right? So we're gonna like show up and we're going to arrest you, right? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and I also think too, with the protests that are going around, I think that there's a lot of contact tracing that's being done with like stingrays and cell phone tracing, which I hope some other folks can talk about a little bit in a little bit. And I would just love like a 1 or 2 sentence summary of FOSTA, SESTA, and EARN IT before we go into them in more detail.
I will do my best. Lorelai is watching me with an amused look on their face. So FOSTA and SESTA were laws that were passed in 2018 that greatly increased the incentive, FOSTA space SESTA. Thank you, Blunt. They greatly increased the incentive for like online service providers, folks like Facebook or Twitter or, you know, Craigslist, to remove any content related to sex work or possibly attributable in any way to sex trafficking, or related to sex trafficking. And we can talk a little bit about how specifically they did that, but that's like the 1-line top level summary. The EARN IT is a pending bill in front of Congress right now that is meant to do some similar, basically engages in some similar legal stuff around child sexual abuse material, incentivizing companies and online platforms to be more potentially invasive in their searches for child sexual abuse material by creating more liability if they're found hosting it. Lorelai, how was that?
Great. I think that was great. It's very, I mean, FOSTA SESTA has a lot of parts, and so it's but I think what you are talking about is the most important part, which is the impact of it and what it incentivizes. And the one thing I would add about Earn It is that I think what Earn It will do that is similar to FOSTA SESTA is that it will incentivize companies to remove all information related to sexual health and anything that teaches youth about sexuality.
Thank you. And I think
Very
we'll be
upbeat.
getting into those a little bit more. I have one more question for Eves. Is turning over health info on the info to the police doable via legal loopholes in legislation like HIPAA, or is this happening in the shadows?
I can also take that one if you'd prefer. So it's HIPAA. So HIPAA, which is the U.S. healthcare privacy law, federal healthcare privacy law, explicitly has a carve out for so-called covered entities, healthcare providers, turning over information to law enforcement. So it specifically says you don't need to get consent from people to turn their information over to law enforcement. So HIPAA doesn't prevent that. You know, another thing, and actually I think this really ties in really nicely to some of the stuff that we wanted to talk about a little bit about, like the Patriot Act, which was sort of legislation that brought in surveillance powers by the US government, passed in 2001, right after September 11th, is that a lot of times, even if there isn't an explicit process for a law enforcement agent or law enforcement or even like a public health entity to request information, like say if they went through appropriate legal process, there are often legal regimes that encourage information share, what's called information sharing, which just basically means like that there are they try to eliminate like privacy or other reasons that information might be siloed between different parts of the government or different governments like federal, state, local. So even if you don't have law enforcement knocking on the health provider's door with a request for information, like a subpoena or whatever, there's often these efforts to kind of standardize and collect and centralize these forms of information. Eves, do you have anything you want to add to that? Did that feel like an adequate summary?
I feel like that was very clear. Yeah.
So I think, Blunt, do you mind if I keep going to talk about Patriot Act stuff for a second? So I think that one of the things that I think is worth noting is that you see a couple like general trends in surveillance, and I'll also let Korika talk more about sort of like how some particular ways this plays out in particular communities, but just on a super high level, like we can see this sort of movement from the Patriot Act to now, where we see more sort of requirements around information sharing. So one big critique of the U.S. government's I hesitate to say intelligence gathering apparatus with a straight face, but intelligence gathering apparatus. What I mean by that is like the CIA, the NSA, right? The sort of intelligence agencies, as opposed to more traditional law enforcement agencies like the FBI or police, was that they were gathering all this data, but they weren't sharing it in ways that were actionable across multiple agencies. So when the Patriot Act was passed after 9/11, one of the goals was to make it easier for agencies to share information. And I think that's been a general trend that's happened like post-Patriot Act into the current moment, where we see things like fusion centers and other ways to collect surveillance data from multiple, and Palantir's databases and ICE's sort of collection data that's collected across multiple different methods of surveillance, and sort of putting it together in order to sort of gain more information about kind of what's going on in the lives of individual people. So that's like one trend I think you can see through the Patriot Act. And obviously, this has dramatic effects on sex working populations, often because often specifically criminalized and over surveilled, but also if often information that is innocuous, sort of not worth raising a red flag about on its own, when combined with other information, can sort of suggest more specifically what kinds of activity folks are engaged with or who folks are spending time with. The other thing I want to highlight about the Patriot Act and sort of surveillance after the, well, two more things I want to highlight, sorry. And, you know, I'm trying to be brief, but the lawyer thing is that everything comes in threes. So I have to have three things I want to highlight about the Patriot Act. Okay, so number two is that you see these particular surveillance tools be originally deployed for what's like considered very, very important law enforcement activity. So like, you know, originally, actually, a lot of the stuff we talked about in the context of anti-terrorism work, and that's what the Patriot Act was about. But over time, often these law enforcement tools get sort of trickle down, for lack of a better term, into sort of more day-to-day enforcement activities. So we've seen these actually a lot with something called the sneak and peek warrant, which that's actually a term that at least Wikipedia tells me that the FBI coined, not anti-surveillance activists, which is just kind of funny that the FBI thinks that's like a good description of what this thing is. But it's basically, you know, traditionally, if someone gets a warrant for searching your property, it's basically a document where you go before a judge and you say, here's why we want to search. And the judge says, okay, you said where you're going to search, you said why you're allowed to, I'm going to sign off on this. And you police can go search that person's house, for example. So traditionally, you know, if you're at the house and police show up, you can ask them to see the warrant and say like, hey, I want to confirm that this is the warrant that, you know, allows you to search my house. What a sneak and peek warrant does is actually allows, this is kind of, it kind of sounds like bullshit, but this is what really happens, right? Allows the police to set up a ruse to to get you out of the house, go into the house and sort of search your stuff. And actually, like one of the contexts in which we've seen this really recently, and one of the reasons I connect this back to the Patriot Act is the surveillance of massage parlor workers in the Robert Kraft case in Florida, where actually what the Florida police did is get a sneak and peek warrant, claim that there was a bomb threat or like a suspicious package on a nearby nearby building. All of the folks who worked in the massage parlors were sort of escorted, be away from the building for their own safety, and the police went in and put cameras in. And we know this because they tried to criminally prosecute Robert Kraft, and Robert Kraft had enough money and to hire a legal team that was able to challenge the validity of the sneak and peek warrant, the warrant that they used to surveil the massage parlor workers as well as other folks who were working there. So, you know, when sneak and peek warrants were included in the Patriot Act, there's nothing in there about human trafficking investigations, let alone what happened, the sort of incident, the stuff that happened in Florida, which like there's no human trafficking prosecutions coming out of it, right? I like from what I've read, and others may know better than I do, so I want to cede whatever claim I have to the truth there, but it doesn't look like there was human trafficking involved. So the sneak and peek warrants weren't initially sort of written into the law for those kinds of investigations, let alone investigations of sort of prostitution. But you know, once these surveillance technologies, and in here I both include technologies in the sort of like computer sense, but also technologies as in like ways governments do surveillance. Once they get written into the law, their use often gets broadly expanded sort of to new populations, new circumstances. It's sort of like you might as well use it. I had a third thing about the Patriot Act, but I guess the third thing I'll say quickly before I stop is that I think one thing you'll see a lot of in discussions about surveillance reform, and especially how it sort of fits into conversations like we might have here about sex work, is sort of an inherent trust that like procedures are going to save people. Which I'm really skeptical of, just sort of personally. But you know, if you look at sort of what happened, you know, between the Patriot Act and now, so there's a thing called Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which basically functionally allowed the national security, the NSA, to search people's call logs to see who was calling who, there was like legitimately a robust debate about this, but one of the sort of reform methods that was actually put on the table and sort of passed as part of the USA Freedom Act in, I want to say 2016, don't quote me on the date, was actually that they were like, okay, great. Well, the government can't hold this giant database of call data anymore. They can't see who you called and when, but they can go to the phone company and ask them. And like, yes, that is better. Like I would rather them like have to go write and ask Verizon nicely before they get the call data. But functionally, I'm like, that's not safety, right? Like, and I think that, you know, when we see a lot of this surveillance, some types of surveillance reform activity, especially post Patriot Act, we're not even getting close to back where we were pre Patriot Act. We're sort of like trying to kind of tinker around the margins / maybe add a teeny bit more process that's not going to help the folks that are most criminalized and most surveilled. Anyway, that was a lot from me, so I'm going to stop. Blunt, do you have another question you want to tee up, or folks want to react to any of that?
I have a question, actually. What is a fusion center?
Well, so I'm gonna, I'll do my best. It's been a little while. Despite the like kind of weird futuristic name, it's basically where all the cops get together. Different types of law enforcement often like have different beats. So one of the like goals of fusion centers is to like combine information and share policing and surveillance information from different law enforcement agencies. So that can be like, you know, the one actually I'm most familiar with is the one I think outside of San Francisco. And there's been a lot of, I don't want to erase, there's been a lot of really amazing research and activism against fusion centers. But actually often and primarily by communities of color. But usually they're like, it's where the San Francisco PD and the Marin County PD, which is like the county north of San Francisco, and the like BART, which is the public transit, one of the public transit organizations, where their cops would all share information and sort of share tips. And they were a result of the sort of the attempt after 9/11 to deal with this, what people saw as this problem of all this information being siloed.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kendra. Corica, I would love to hear from you if you feel like now's a good time to chime in.
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit on the history of surveillance. So as Kendra stated earlier, marginalized communities have historically been affected, have been victims of government surveillance. And surveillance does have roots in slavery. So in 1713, New York City passed lantern laws. And these laws were used to regulate Black and Indian slaves at night. So if you were over the age of 14, you could not appear in the streets without some kind of lighted candle so that the police could identify you. And we've seen like this same thing recently with the NYPD, where they are shining surveillance like floodlights in Black communities. And we saw that increase after they received a lot of criticism over stop and frisk. And people in those neighborhoods were reporting that they could not sleep at night, like the lights were just blinding them. And Simone Brown has written a lot about this subject and how the ways in which light has been used to surveil people. And I believe they also write about technology as well and how we've moved to that side of things. So in regards to technology surveillance, one of the most well-known abuses of surveillance by the government is COINTELPRO. And I think it just stands for Counterintelligence Program. And it was basically a series of illegal surveillance projects conducted by the FBI aimed at surveilling and discrediting, disrupting political organizations. So the FBI in particular targeted feminist organizations, communist organizations, and civil rights organizations. And the government's job was basically to do whatever they could to just like disband them and get rid of them by any means necessary. And they mostly did this through like wiretaps, listening in on people's phone calls, tracking them down. as well as having informants involved as well. And as a result of this, quite a few people were murdered or put into prison. Some Black members of the Black Panther Party are still in prison. And two of the most talked about people who are victims of this are Martin Luther King Jr., as well as Fred Hampton, who was drugged by an FBI informant and then murdered by Chicago police. But also Angela Davis has been a victim of this as well. And again, we know that these practices are still continuing today. So we kind of got into like the protesters and how they're being surveilled. And I think it came out in 2018, 2019, that Black Lives Matter activists were being watched. Their activity was being watched on the internet. And now we've seen recent reports that protesters today are being watched as well, either through body cameras, cell site simulators, license plate readers, social media, drones, as well as just cameras in that area that may use facial recognition technology that could help the police identify who the protester is and get access to your social media accounts. So these are all like issues that are happening today. As technology increases, we've only seen it get worse. And we know that marginalized communities are the most affected by this. If they use this on Black, Native, Latinx, immigrant communities, they're also going to use this on others as well. Sex workers mostly fall into marginalized communities. So I don't know if I should talk about the third party doctrine right now, if I should wait, because it's a little bit different, but okay, I'll just go ahead. So kind of transitioning a little bit, the third party doctrine is a doctrine that comes out of two Supreme Court cases, United States v. Miller and Smith v. Maryland. And what they say is that if you voluntarily give your information to third parties, then you have no reasonable expectation of privacy. So third parties include your phone company, Verizon, Sprint, email servers if you use Gmail, internet service providers, and as well as banks. And so that means that the government can obtain your information from these companies without having a warrant. So they don't have to have like probable cause that you're doing something in order to get access to this information. And the Supreme Court's logic behind this decision was that, well, if you tell someone something, then you're giving up your privacy, and like you can't expect that will stay private forever. What I should also back up and say that these cases were decided in the 70s. So not today where like our whole life is on the internet and we are constantly giving third parties our information. And actually Justice Sotomayor, she has suggested that she would like the court to rethink the third party doctrine because it's just a completely different time today. A lot of us use our GPS and we wouldn't think that like, I don't know, that they could just share all of our information without us knowing. And I will say that if you're ever curious about like how often the government is requesting access to this information, some companies like Google, I think Facebook and Sprint, they do report this. I know Google reports it under transparency reports, and you can see how often the government has asked them. Oh, it's too old. Oh, okay. Well, Oh.
That was me.
No, that was for
me
me. I'm sorry.
messaging Blunt. Sorry, and I fucked up.
Okay, so hopefully they're still updating it, and you can see. I think it's usually around like 100,000 people a year, but we don't know like what the result of that is. It's honestly probably a lot of people who aren't doing anything at all. And so we've also seen like some people starting to move their email accounts from using Gmail to email servers that care a little bit more about privacy and that are more willing to fight these requests from the government. And then I'll also say the last thing is that the government can also request that these companies like not tell you at all that they've requested this information. So this could be done completely in secret as well.
So I think I want to just sort of flag some stuff that Karika said and sort of like highlight certain parts of it. And I want to sort of contextualize a little bit of this. I think, you know, often we're sort of talking here about sort of privacy from law enforcement, and the primary source of privacy from law enforcement in the US is the Fourth Amendment, which is so obvious. Karika didn't say it, but I'm going to say it just in case it isn't obvious for other folks. And, you know, one thing worth noting about the Fourth Amendment for like folks who are sort of concerned about like the relationship between all of these legal doctrines and like their actual lives. You know, for many, like often I want to contextualize for folks that having Fourth Amendment protection or like saying, oh, the US government violated the Fourth Amendment only gets you so far, because if what you want is the government not to have access to that information, the horse has already left the barn, if to use the right metaphor. Which is to say that most of the remedies that come from, you know, unconstitutional searches and seizures or unconstitutional requests for information just are about like not that information not being able to be used against you in court, which is of very limited value if what you're concerned about is like the safety of yourself or your community, of not getting folks arrested, or if you don't have access to the kinds of representation or resources that would allow you to go through a legal battle and you're going to plea out the second that like you get arrested. So, you know, I always want to caution any story I tell or any story we tell about like the importance of constitutional rights in this area with sort of like a little bit of realpolitik about like what does it mean, or like sort of real talk about what does it mean to have access to these kinds of rights. The other thing I want to flag is sort of one, like what Karika said is 100% correct as a matter of doctrinal law. One thing I will note is that there's something slightly counterintuitive that has happened with regards to the third-party doctrine and government access to data, which is a lot of the larger online service providers, and in this I include Google and Twitter, some of the like Facebook, actively will not provide certain types of information absent like appropriate legal process. So it's actually legally contestable whether the government can get access to your email that's stored on a server without a warrant. It has to do something with how, in certain contexts, with how old the email is and whether it looks like it's been abandoned on the server, which like the statute that covers that, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, was passed in the 1980s, and boy, does it read like it. Like, good luck. But point being that, in fact, Gmail will require a warrant to get access to your email content. That's great, except that, you know, if your email content gets turned over and then you then want to challenge it, you're still in the same place you were previously, which is that the government has access to the email, and that could mean like serious consequences for you, independent of whether it's later admissible in court. So, you know, part of when we talk about sort of thinking about legal literacy in this space, what I want to encourage and like folks to think about is, okay, how do I keep me and my community and my people safe, independent of like the legal remedies? Because oftentimes those legal remedies aren't accessible to everybody, like just realistically and very obviously, and or sort of will help you after the fact. Maybe it means you recover money, or maybe it means that like the evidence isn't used against you in court, but that doesn't actually help very much if what you're concerned about is like the safety of you and your people. So just making sure that we don't pretend that these remedies like will actually sort of make people whole for the like harms that they experience of surveillance state or from the government. But rather that like, some of these protective measures that folks can take are about sort of trying to prevent the types of harm that the surveillance might cause in the first place. Also, one more quick note is that a relatively recent Supreme Court decision has suggested that the government does need a warrant to access your cell phone location. So that was like one little bit of good news in a sea of terribleness that is the third-party doctrine.
I think I'll respond to a little bit of that, to say that I'm thinking about the connections between what Eves has been talking about and then what you folks are talking about in terms of the way that information gets used against you that isn't really cognizable in the law, but once they have your information and have you on their radar, they use that information to get more information, to follow you, to trace your contacts, and that happening in multiple different contexts. And something that I think is really important that people don't think about all the time is that everyone breaks the law, and and it is people who are criminalized. So we think of criminalization as being about behavior, but it is really about people and communities, because everyone breaks the law, and the only folks who are targeted by police, and I mean state police, federal police, etc., like those are the folks who get punished for breaking the law. And that punishment can be, because they have followed you for a certain period of time in order to collect enough information in order to make something cognizable in the law. So I'm thinking about how one of the themes of what we've been talking about is the deputizing of folks who are not thought of as law enforcement agencies, but whose collection of your information becomes a way of enforcing behavioral norms, and that happening in a way that goes beyond what criminal law can even do. And so thinking about sort of the modern history of how this has happened in law, that in some of the laws that we've been talking about, some of the federal laws that we've been talking about. So the Patriot Act, one thing to think about in terms of the Patriot Act is how prior to 9/11, Congress had been considering passing some form of regulation for internet companies and data regarding data collection. And Kendra, please jump in if I am, messing this up, or anyone, obviously. But when 9/11 happened, that regulation sort of was pushed to the side. And it is during this time period that we have this sort of, we have the increase in government surveillance, but we also have this sort of recognition by private corporations that data collection is something that can be monetized. And they are unregulated in doing this. And there is this idea that if you have given over your information voluntarily, it belongs to those people, regardless of whether you did it knowingly or not. And so we have this sort of rise of data collection that is a creation of surveillance tools by corporations. And there's sort of a monetary incentive to keep creating stronger and stronger data collection tools that can be more and more invasive and do this kind of contact tracing that does the thing that Eves has been talking about, that you folks have been talking about, where each piece of information looks innocuous, but when you put it together, you have a map of who you are. And that's especially concerning for sex working people because they identify sex working people based on this collection of seemingly innocuous information. And you have the incentive to create tools that are more and more effective at collecting that information. And then you have the partnership between government and private companies that then allows that information to be used in order to enforce norms that are expected by the state, that are thought of as beneficial to the state. And obviously targeting people in the sex trades at a high rate, and especially people in the sex trades who are part of other marginalized communities. And so FOSTA and Earn It are just sort of, I think we talk about FOSTA a lot as though it is like a revolutionary law that was passed, as though it made huge changes in the law. And it did make a change to one specific law that I think people thought of as being sort of dramatic, that's Section 230. However, it really was just an evolution out of stuff that had already been happening. So FOSTA's purpose and Earn It's purpose as well, one of the main purposes of both of these laws is to decrease limits on civil liability for internet companies. And you can think of that as being Congress sort of taking their responsibility away from themselves in terms of regulating these companies and deputizing civilians to do that regulating for them, and also deputizing corporations to create rules and collect data that is thought of or is publicized as having some impact on trafficking and sexual exploitation and sexual violence, but all of that being simply a show and actually increasing sex workers' vulnerability to exploitation. And when you decrease our ability to communicate with each other, when you decrease our ability to be visible online, when you decrease our ability to share information, health and safety information, you increase folks' vulnerability to violence and exploitation. And I noticed that someone asked earlier whether Earn It had a piece about not prohibiting sexual health information for youth, and it doesn't at all. But what it does is increase civil liability so that it incentivizes companies to draw the line further than the law specifies. And that is the same thing that FOSTA does. So these laws, because civil liability can be, right, anybody can sue, so think about, in terms of criminal law enforcement, that you need specific resources, like the police and the FBI, and policing that happens on all of these different levels, state and federal. I mean, they do have, obviously this has been in public conversation for especially recently, is how many resources these folks do have, and it is a obscene amount of resources. However, it is still less likely that you will be subject to criminal prosecution than that as a company you will be subject to a lawsuit. And the lawsuits also have a lower requirement in court in order to have liability. Like civil liability, you have to show less in court than you do to prove criminal liability. And so when you increase civil liability, you incentivize companies to draw the line much further than the law specifies, because they want to get rid of even the appearance of liability, and even, because also lawsuits are expensive, regardless of whether the claims can be proven or not. So I'll stop there.
No, I wanted to make sure that we take a few minutes to sort of talk about what FOSTA, SESTA, and what Earn It are amending. So Kendra, I would love just like a 2-minute summary of Section 230, and then Lorelei, if you wanted to sort of continue with what Earn It is and what Earn It's proposing, and why and the ways in which it's so overly broad that things like queer sex ed could get caught up in it.
Yeah, and I think actually I want to sort of tag on to the end of what Lorelei was saying, because I think it ties perfectly into a discussion about Section 230, which is to say the sort of what we lawyers would call commandeering, but the use of the of private companies to do things that the government like isn't sure that it has the political capital or will to sort of push forward. It's not just because they like can make it happen using civil liability. It also is like much harder to bring a First Amendment challenge to like companies deciding voluntarily to over enforce their own rules, which they're not bound by the First Amendment, versus the government making a particular rule, which would be susceptible to a First Amendment challenge. So, you know, and I can talk a little bit more about that, but I just want to put that point on what Lorelei was saying, which is that, you know, it's not this sort of delegating these responsibilities to private companies is not just better from a like, oh, you can kind of throw up your hands and claim no moral responsibility for what happens, but also it limits the ability of individuals that are harmed by these sort of changes to legal regimes to effectively challenge them. So let me talk about 230, which I think will help us even better conceptualize some of the stuff, and then we can jump back to sort of FOSTA and SESTA and earn it. So Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act was passed in 1996. I'm really bad with years. Anyway, passed in 1996. And it was originally part of like a omnibus anti-porn bill, like that had everything that was supposed to like restrict minors from seeing porn on the internet. Everybody in the 90s was real worried about porn on the internet. It turned out that most of that bill was unconstitutional. It was struck down by the Supreme Court in a case called ACLU versus Reno. But what was left was this like one provision that hadn't gotten a ton of attention when it was passed, called Section 230. And what Section 230 does is it says that no online service provider can be held liable for the sort of or to be held to be the publisher of content where someone else like sort of spoke it online. Okay, what the fuck does that mean? So let's take Yelp, for example. On Yelp, there are Yelp reviews, and Yelp reviews are posted by third parties. So if I post a Yelp review of my local carpet cleaner, I always use carpet cleaners because there's a funny case involving carpet cleaners. Anyway, Yelp be Hadid. Anyway, I post a review of my local carpet cleaner, who I've never gone to. They have cleaned or not cleaned 0 of my carpets. And I say, these people are scumbags. They ripped me off. They told me that it was going to cost $100 to clean all my carpets. And then they charged me $3,000 and I got bed bugs. So that statement I'm making is potentially defamatory. They could, like the carpet company could potentially sue me for defamation, presuming I had no interaction with them, because it's not true and it harms their reputation and it might harm their business. What Section 230 says is carpet company can come after me, Kendra, for posting that lie about their carpet cleaning services, but they can't sue Yelp. Or if they sue Yelp, they're going to lose because Yelp has no way of knowing whether my carpet review is true or false. So that's like sort of the original core meaning of Section 230. It's gotten really broadly interpreted for lots of relatively good reasons to cover all kinds of different legal claims that folks might make against internet platforms. So right now, there have been something like somewhere in the realm of like 20 different lawsuits against Twitter for facilitating terrorism, all of them, you know, thrown out on Section 230 grounds. The one that sort of most relevant to our conversation right now is a case out of Massachusetts called Doe v. Backpage, which was brought by a number of like folks, survivors of trafficking against Backpage.com for what they claimed was complicity and sort of knowledge of the ads that were placed on Backpage that like they were harmed as a result of. And the First Circuit, which is a sort of one step below the Supreme Court in terms of courts, said that's all very well and good, but Backpage isn't the speaker of any of those ads. They didn't write the ads. They don't know anything about the ads. We're throwing out this case. And in the aftermath of that, Congress was like, this shall not stand, and passed FOSTA and SESTA. And I'll turn it over to Lorelei to talk more about that.
I didn't know my time was coming so soon.
Sorry. Do you want me to? I can keep going, but I figure like y'all, I'm bored of hearing you talk. So
Musical
I imagine
interlude.
people.
I think I'm curious what the audience's questions are about FOSTA SESTA, because I do think there's been quite a bit of information written about them, about that law, and I wouldn't want to just like talk on and on about it when it's not focused toward what people want to hear. Or should I talk about Earn It, or should we? I don't know. Someone tell me.
I think we did a summary of FOSTA SESTA. I would love like another one sentence summary of FOSTA SESTA, the impact, and then what the fuck Earn It is and where it's at. I think would be helpful.
Yeah. So we can talk about why Section 230 matters to these laws.
Yeah.
Yeah. So FOSTA SESTA does several things. Does like 6 things in federal law, including create a new crime under the Mann Act, which is originally the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910, and it's been renamed, but it's not better. Oh boy. So it creates new crimes. That's one thing that it does. But it also changes Section 230 so that it no longer protects against lawsuits under federal law regarding specifically the federal anti-trafficking law 1591, 18 USC 1591, in case anyone wants that number. And so what that does, it's not clear that Section 230 was actually preventing people from suing companies, specifically Backpage. Backpage was the center of congressional conversations and the center of media attention. And the claim was that Backpage was going they were not being able to be held accountable for trafficking that was happening on their website. But actually the First Circuit case was maybe just didn't have enough evidence yet to show how actually Backpage could have been held responsible regardless of Section 230, because Backpage was doing things like editing ads and that kind of thing that would have made them liable in a way that's unlike Yelp. And so okay, but people started talking about Section 230 because there was a documentary made about the First Circuit case, and it was very well publicized, and that documentary was shown in Congress. And people started talking about Section 230 as though that was the thing, preventing lawsuits. I mean, another important piece to remember about making civil liability the place where we enforce anti-trafficking law and anti-exploitation law is that it puts the onus on victims of trafficking and victims of exploitation to bring those lawsuits that are very expensive, that lawyers for those claims are inaccessible. You have to spend years talking about your trauma. And it takes such a long time to get, if you are going to even get compensation, and then at the end you get monetary compensation if you win your lawsuit, but it doesn't prevent trafficking and it doesn't prevent exploitation. We know that there are other methods of doing that that are much more effective, and many of those methods involve the investment of resources. I think this is one of the reasons that this is happening, is that many of those solutions involve the investment of resources in marginalized communities. And instead, Congress wants to pass bills that don't require the redistribution of wealth in this country. So Earn It does something similar to Section 230. And the way that FOSTA makes a carve out in Section 230 around the federal anti-trafficking laws, Earn It makes a carve out in Section 230 around the child exploitation laws, specifically child sexual abuse material laws. And similarly, when Kendra and I did this research, there hasn't been a lot of examples of Section 230 preventing those claims being brought. So again, it feels a little bit more like this is for show than anything else. But we can predict that the impact that Earn It will have will be very similar to the impact that FOSTA had in terms of the removal of information online and the censoring of people online, and the not just the removal of information, but the prohibition on specific people talking. And we think that based on our analysis of Earn It, that that impact will be really on queer youth. So because that's the specific community for whom there's a lot of fear around sexual information being shared. And it's also a specific community who is seeking that information out. Because I mean, just having been a queer youth once myself, I know that like, you just don't necessarily have access to folks when you're a kid who can tell you that you're okay and you're normal. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lorelai. And I wonder too if Eves and Karika, if you have anything that you'd like to add before we open it up to the Q&A.
I mean, I think that, y'all covered it pretty well, right? Like, I think that like everybody covered a lot of stuff. I mean, I've been looking at the questions and I also only really have like a little bit to say in terms of like, the way that we see a lot of this happen, right? We've obviously talked about criminalization, we've talked about censorship, and kind of like what happens, but specifically in talking on this panel around like the impact on sex workers and like marginalized communities, like the ways that we really see a lot of this happen in the push for this, right? Like whenever there's an increase in surveillance, like that increases the scope, it's going to increase the scope of policing and also the general like stigmatization, right? So we don't like, I think everybody kind of knows that I'm like most knowledgeable in terms of like the impact on in-person sex work. But like when we also look at the impact of these things have on like digital sex work that has gotten so much more popular during these times, right? We also see that all of these groups and like the groups that are behind these bills to begin with, right, are pushing for other forms of censorship or limitations being put on not just sex workers, but other marginalized communities, but also like, we know that these intersect, we know that there are intersections here, right? Is that they ask people like credit card companies to not accept payments for sex workers. We've seen that happen, right? And like in terms of like in-person sex work, and Lorelai talked about this, right? People get pushed into the most dangerous forms of sex work, make them more vulnerable. In fact, make them more vulnerable to the human trafficking that these people are so against, and make everybody so much more vulnerable to all of these things, which we like kind of talked about. And I think is kind of important in talking about like the questions that I'm kind of seeing about, what do we do? Because I feel like a part of our conversation kind of scares everybody into being like, oh my gosh, like I should just not use social media. I shouldn't like even text, which I don't want people to think that that is the case, right? I think that like all of these different encryption methods and these things, right, although, right, I do not think that they're foolproof, which they're not. Like there's still many ways in which the police and like other agencies can get access to this information. One of those ways being like whomever you're sending the information to, and like wherever that information kind of ends up, if you're like, sync it to your laptop, if you sync it to your phone, all of these different ways, right? But like these are tools that can protect you, right? So I think that if you want to use encryption methods, if you want to use like these different sort of like, proton mail to like encrypt your email, if you want to use WhatsApp and all of these things, right, and iMessage that encrypts your messages, that's a good thing, right? And take the precautions that you have, but know that they're not foolproof, which is, I kind of also want to talk about, like, Kendra kind of talked about this, about the reforms and like what they look like and how we think that we like solve this, or how people think that they've been solving it, right? Obviously, I came into this conversation, I told everybody that I'm an abolitionist, right? I work with abolitionist groups. I think that at the end of the day, what it says, like, surveillance is a strategy that they use in policing before this technology existed, before they started doing this stuff. They've always used surveillance, and it's just an arm of policing. At the end of the day, the problem is policing that has always been used and meant to use to disappear communities, right? So like, at the bigger fight that we're fighting is policing. So I don't want people to think that the fear is like, oh, you shouldn't do anything. The truth is, like, if you're a marginalized person, if you're a sex working person, any of those things, they are going to want to police you no matter what. And we're like fighting against that.
Thank you so much for that. Karika, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
I will say I went to a conference. It was a law for Black Lives, I think is what it's called. And they do things around like the law and liberation of Black people. And the speaker talked about how, like, have you ever noticed if you lived in a Black neighborhood or a person of color, people of color neighborhood, police are everywhere. But if you live in white neighborhoods, police are not there. And it's not because there's more crime in one area over another. In fact, like police just like make the crime worse. And I thought about that a lot because I've lived in Black neighborhoods, I've lived in white neighborhoods, and there is a stark difference. And there is still like crime happening in the white neighborhood, but nothing like police weren't there. So I think it is important to think about how policing is the problem. And then one other thing I forgot to bring up is that before this talk, I was doing like research on like what's been happening lately, because I feel like there's just always so much happening. And something that I missed was that some police departments that NYPD and Chicago Police Department, they have been putting like ads, uh, sex ads on websites, and people will text that number looking for services, and the NYPD police department will send them a message saying, I have it like pulled up, it will say like, this is the New York Police Department. Your response to an online ad for prostitution has been logged. Offering to pay someone for sexual conduct is a crime and is punishable for up to 7 years of incarceration. And yeah, so people in that article were talking about how the police have access to their name and their phone number, and they don't know like what's going to happen to them. Like, are they just logged in some database? And I think it's safe to assume that they probably are logged into some kind of database. And I think as we think about how, as you said, how sex work is becoming even more digital with the time that we're in, like the impact of this on sex workers, I'm guessing is going to be really large. So yeah, I just wanted to bring up that extra way that surveillance is happening.
I actually want to add one more thing that I intended to say and forgot to say, which is just that in terms of this question of what we do, I do think that one other point to make is that when they're passing these laws, something else they're doing is deputizing us to police ourselves and to chill our own speech and to prevent us from organizing and to prevent us from using any tools at all to communicate with each other and to talk about these issues. So I don't know. I do think that it is a mistake for us to use this as a reason not to speak to each other. I mean, that is like really what we're talking about when we talk about not using online tools and other, electronic tools of communication that are.
Yeah, it's really interesting too. And right now, some of Hacking Hustling's researchers are wrapping up the survey that we were doing on content moderation and how it impacts sex workers and activists who are talking about Black Lives Matters over the last few months. And like, we're definitely noticing themes of speech being chilled, just like we did with our research on Fossa Sesta, as well as the impact of like platform policing on both social media and financial technologies is just about doubled for people who do both sex work and are vocally protesting or identify as activists. And the numbers are just very intense. So like, I think being mindful about how we communicate rather than not communicating is a form of harm reduction and community care. And I also see that this panel as a form of of harm reduction and community care, and like this in partnership with our digital literacy training, because I do believe that the more that we know, the more that we're able to engage meaningfully when legislation like this comes up. And like a lot of these laws aren't written to be read by the communities that they impact, and they're often intentionally written to be unintelligible to the communities that they impact, and think that they can just like get them signed into law without having to check in with the communities that are harmed by this legislation. So I think that anything that we can do to better understand this and like decrease that gap between the people who are writing this legislation or the like tech lawyers who are opposing this legislation, and like bringing in our own lived experiences is incredibly important work.
I also, well, I know we want to, I'll stop. Blunt, you want to do Q&A? I can.
Sure, we can do Q&A. If you had one thing to add, that's fine.
So I guess the only other like thought I have there, I think Blunt is totally right, but like, you know, it can feel kind of like, oh my God, there's so much. And like that, I think is like one of the hard things about talking about surveillance is like, yeah, you know, police and law enforcement have so many tools in their arsenal. And like, you know, but at the same time, like you know, we care for each other by like creating space to talk about like what makes us feel safer and how can we like make take risks that we all agree to be taking, right? Risk-aware, consensual, non-encrypted communication. Well,
I love that.
it rolls just right off the tongue. But I think I want to also highlight what Eves was saying in terms of kind of like the problem is policing. You know, I think one of the, and Cory Kizaemon also said the same thing. So, you know, what we're all saying in terms of problem being policing, and like the solution not just being like finding more ways to like slightly narrow the surveillance tools. I think one of the real problems around surveillance, like sort of surveillance debates generally, and I say this as somebody who sort of comes out of a technology law tradition, is like that the folks who are doing work on like sort of high level surveillance tools, like things like the sneak and peek warrants or Section 215 of the Patriot Act, are often deeply disconnected from the communities who are most likely to be harmed once these surveillance tools are widely sort of used, right? Like that, just like with the technology laws, right? There is this way in which, you know, the conversation around like mass surveillance is up here, and we're supposed to be afraid of mass surveillance because mass surveillance means surveillance of white folks like me and not communities of color, right? Like, but at the same time, you know, that so much of the rhetoric relies on like the idea that it's okay to surveil some folks, but it's not okay to surveil others. And part of how we fight back is by like deconstructing the notion that it's okay to do this, to use these tools on anybody. That like, you know, it doesn't like, it's not actually like, oh, there's a bad enough set of crimes to make this okay, right? Like, and that's part of it is not getting sucked into this sort of like whirlpool of like, well, is terrorism worse than human trafficking? Well, if terrorism isn't worse, if they're both equally bad, then we need to have the same tools to prosecute human trafficking that we do to terrorism, right? And here we are, like, where they're getting a sneak and peek warrant to go into a massage parlor in Florida, right? Like, and you know, I don't say that flippantly because those are like real folks' lives, just like there are real folks' lives who are impacted by surveillance of theoretical terrorist communities, you know, looking at sort of all of the mosques in Detroit and all of the mosques in New York where they're like, where folks were under like persistent surveillance post 9/11. So, you know, I think part of what we do is resist the urge to say, okay, it's okay if this happened to other people. You know, because that's how the tools get built that will like eventually be used against like all of us. That was what I wanted to say. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kendra. Okay, so we're gonna open it up for Q&A. Someone asked if we could touch on the recent encryption legislation and how protected we are using services like Signal, WhatsApp, and Telegram.
I can take that, and then if Lorelei and Blunt, if you want to jump in if I screw it up. So in Earn It was one of the sort of pieces of legislation that was kind of proposed to make it sort of, I don't want to say end encryption, but would have had the practical effect of making encrypted services more difficult to sort of produce. The other is the LAED, I think LAID. That's probably not how people have been pronouncing it. Which that bill is way worse. I do not think it's going to pass. It like sort of all out tries to ban encryption. Earn It actually sort of between the initial proposal and the sort of version of the bill we're currently on got much better on encryption. So now it specifically says that using encryption isn't supposed to be able to be used against a service, for purposes of figuring out whether they're liable for child exploitation material. It's really that it turns out that construction is not just complicated when I say it, but very complicated in the bill and might do less. In terms of what the impact is going to be on like Signal, WhatsApp, and Telegram. And, so what I'm hearing in this question is sort of end-to-end encrypted services, where the service provider doesn't have access to your your communications. I think that it would be unlikely if God forbid Earn It as currently existing passes, I think it would be unlikely to sort of result in Signal or WhatsApp going away. In fact, actually, some advocates are currently, Mike Masnick in particular, are currently arguing that the current internet construction encourages additional encryption. I'm a little more skeptical than he is about that. Happy to sort of, I don't know, talk about that. At me on Twitter if you want to talk about that. I don't like those services are not going away under the current version of Earn It. However, the Justice Department has been trying to sort of get backdoors into encrypted services for a long time, and they're not going to stop. So it's sort of nothing to watch for right now, but stay vigilant on that front.
I don't know.
Kendra, sorry. I have a question, but I don't want to interrupt if you want to add something, Eves.
I just wanted to generally say, right, like, I think, if the question is kind of getting at, like, in your personal life, like, how, like, what's the danger, or, like, if you're doing some kind of, like, criminalized work or something that you are afraid of, like, the police getting information of, right? Like, it's not going to do you harm to use an end-to-end encryption, like, service, like iMessage, like WhatsApp, like Signal, like Telegram, right? But it's not something that's going to, like, protect you wholly, but also should note that, like, if, like, the person asking this question is, like, an organizer or a whore, like, so, like, when most of the time when this information gets in the hands of police from, like, your texts or things like that, it's not because they've, like, hacked the system. It's not like something like that. It's usually because someone you've talked to has, like, the police have gotten a hold of them, they've given that information to them, and, like, the ways, like, I kind of talked about this at the beginning, right? When they deputize civilians, we're not just, like, generally, like, I literally just mean that, like, there are also people who are just going to be like, I think that there's a sex worker at my hotel, like, da, 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 da. I think there's a sex worker in my Uber, right? And, like, handing over that information. So I don't want people to be like, oh, I'm just, like, not safe anywhere, because that's not really what the scenario looks like in real life when you're, like, on the street and, like, working, right? But they're not, like, fully safe. Like, it's not like, oh, you can type anything into Signal and it's, like, Gucci.
Right. Yeah. And I think people can take screenshots, like, oftentimes that's how information is shared, even when you're using encrypted channels. So I just think also just being mindful about what you say, who you're saying it to. Like, if you're using Zoom, knowing that this is going to be a public facing document and we're not, like, currently planning any political uprisings in this meeting. So, like, it feels okay and comfortable to be using Zoom as the platform. But like, personally, in my work, even if I'm using an encrypted platform, like, I don't say anything that would I do my best to avoid saying things that would, like, hold up in court as evidence in the way that I use language.
Yeah, I think of the immortal words of Naomi Lauren of Whose Corner Is It Anyway? People need to learn how to stop talking. Which it turns out is both like solid advice from Naomi Lauren and also like what my advice is if the police want to talk to you. So like, you know, solid on many different fronts.
I think it's really important. Like I think several people have said this already, but just to really emphasize that when we're talking about this stuff, the intention is to have, you know, informed consent. I don't know, for lack of a better word, of using these tools, and that, you know, well, especially if we're talking about sex working people, we're talking Katie Simon. I'm sorry, I had to interrupt myself to get excited that Katie Simon is here. Another expert on all of this stuff. The thing that I was going to say is that I do think that sex working people and criminalized folks from many marginalized communities are really good already at risk assessment, understanding what level of risk you are comfortable with, and then using these tools with that in mind, and knowing that there are no answers, right? There's no system except abolition that is going to prevent these kinds of harms from happening. Abolition of actually policing and capitalism, perhaps. And the thing I was going to say, which is maybe not that important, but the question I had for Kendra was about whether you think encryption is still part of EARN IT in terms of the best practices and how that might inform policing of corporations. I'm not sure if that's too far in the weeds. I don't know if it's just worth
I think
mentioning.
it could be. I think one of the things we've been saying about EARN IT sort of internally on the Hacking Hustling organizing, which I want to sort of emphasize here, is that like the lack of clarity around what the hell EARN IT's going to do is a feature of the bill that is intended by its creators, not a problem, right? That's not a we're failing at interpretation, because we're not. But I can say all I want what I think EARN IT means with regards to Signal and Telegram, but as Lorelei pointed out, one of the things EARN IT does is create this like commission that's going to make some best practices, which who the hell knows what's going to be in there. And also like it's just really unclear exactly how the liability bits are going to shake out. So like, even with a specific amendment to the current version of EARN IT that's supposed to protect encrypted services, like we don't really know what's going to happen. So yeah, really good point, Lorelei. Thank you.
Blunt, you're muted.
I'm muted. Okay. Other than being educated or somehow not using any technology, what can we do? I feel like we touched on that a little bit, but if anyone wants to give a quick summary.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to echo what Lorelei and Yves have already said, right? Like engage in thoughtful conversations around how you're using the technology, and like be thoughtful around how you're using it, who you're sharing what with, like I think for me, and actually maybe this gets to the next question, which is sort of like, it doesn't matter if you don't break the law, or like, what, but I don't have anything to hide, right? The way I think about this, and, is that like everyone has something that law enforcement could use to like make your life miserable. That's just reality. Some folks have many more things, like, but everyone has something. And so not my goal, like our goal, I think here is not to sort of suggest like paranoia, they could be listening to everything, although, yes, I'm pretty sure that there's a legal authority to do most things that law enforcement wants to do. And like, I'm not under any illusions about that. But so part of how we think about this is, how do we take care of the folks around us and be thoughtful around the risks that we're taking, and make sure that like we're taking risks that are aligned with our values and the things we need to do. Right, like and that like those are going to look different for everybody. But I welcome thoughts from other folks on the panel, because I think I said enough.
I think I'd like to add something, which is that oftentimes when we talk about this stuff, we talk about it in terms of personal risk, as though a risk belongs to us alone, when I think it's really important to recognize the communities that you're interacting with and the people that you're interacting with, and to understand that even if you feel as though law enforcement won't do anything to you, you're not a likely target, it's highly likely that there are people in your life who are likelier targets, and your refusal to talk to law enforcement or your care around how you communicate with folks is protective of the people around you and the people that you care about, who you might not even know what their levels of risk are. And then the other thing I want to add in terms of things to do is that to think about what actions you're capable of to oppose the passage of anti-encryption laws, to oppose the passage of laws that target sex working people and people of color and people in marginalized communities, and to think about, if you feel as though you have a lower level of risk of being targeted by law enforcement, that means that you have a greater capability for maybe going out and protesting. I have to tell you, I know a lot of criminalized people who do not feel safe protesting on the street, do not feel safe talking on unencrypted platforms, don't feel safe talking on panels like this. And if you feel safe doing those things, then it's your responsibility to do those things. So.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna try and, oh yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I don't know if you're gonna ask the next question, but like Lorelai and Kendra kind of talked about it a bit. I kind of just like want to say, like, if someone asks you or says that like it doesn't matter if you don't break the law, that's not really a part of the issue, right? Like laws, crimes, the things that we define as crimes are entirely arbitrary, right? So who gets arrested, who gets criminalized, all of these things are just simply based on who like the system is against, which we know that means Black, Indigenous, people of color, especially trans people, any gender non-conforming people, sex working people, anybody who is like outside the scope of what like white supremacist, like ableist patriarchy would consider to be like a good and appropriate person, right? So it's not really about like breaking laws, or like you shouldn't be afraid of anything if you haven't done anything, because it doesn't matter. They're going to criminalize people regardless of that, right? They're going to incarcerate people regardless of that. Like all of these things are a death sentence to marginalized folks, which is why we kind of talk about it in this way. It's not about like, it is about like surveillance is like bad, is like infringing upon rights of people, right? But it's also about the fact that surveillance is just like a tool that is used for policing, for incarceration, in order to just like disappear whomever, right? So when talking about that, surveillance is bad for that reason, is for the reason like I talked about a little bit with contact tracing, right? That in theory should be a good thing, should mean that we are keeping people safe, should mean that people aren't getting COVID or getting treated for COVID or getting treated for HIV/AIDS. But we know that in a world where we have policing, that is simply not what happens, right? It's not a case of will they use it? They will use it. They will criminalize people. They will arrest people. So we want to get rid of it wholesale.
Yeah, and I think too, when you talk about contact tracing in that capacity, I can't help but think about the ways that data is scraped from escort ads to facilitate the deplatforming across social media and financial technologies of sex workers and other marginalized communities, as well as activists. So I think like both on the streets and on the platforms, like this is not being used for good, and that it needs to end. Okay, I'm going to try and get one or two more questions in. Someone asked, do you think that EARN IT is going to be passed? I think that's our official comment.
Yeah, for anyone who's like not watching the video or not able to watch the video, there was just a lot of shrugging.
Yeah, but if you keep following Hacking Hustling, we'll keep talking about EARN IT and updates when they come. So if you want to follow at Hacking Hustling on Twitter, that's usually where our most up-to-date shit is. Someone said, hypothetically, if someone wants to be a lawyer and is studying the LSAT and hoping to apply in the fall, should they not post publicly about these things or attend protests where you could be arrested?
I can take that one. You can absolutely post publicly about these things. So the thing to worry about here is that the like for lawyers is this thing called character and fitness, which is basically if you want to practice as a lawyer after you go to law school, you have to get admitted to one of the state bars, and state bars have particular requirements. I actually don't know a ton about how those interact with like a past history of sex work, but the sort of watchword in terms of like thinking about character and fitness is honesty, generally speaking. Like the goal, folks generally, pretty much most things are overcomable through character and fitness if you explain sort of what happened. So getting arrested at a protest, like that's, you can totally still pass the bar and become a lawyer through that. Absolutely posting publicly about like abolition or sex work or, you know, those kinds of things. You know, where I would start to sort of think about whether you want to talk to someone who has more experience about this than me is if you have felonies on your record, or if you're sort of worried that you have any behavior that folks might believe makes you less honest. So things like fraud convictions often come up, but I'll stop there.
Awesome. And then I think this will be our last question as we're just at time. Any books recommendation along with Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness by Simone Brown? So anyone want to yell out a few suggestions? It sounds like folks are interested and want to learn more.
This isn't a book, but Alvaro Bedoya recently wrote a law review piece on the color of surveillance. And it's the speech she gave. It's really well written. It's really amazing. So I really highly recommend that.
Will you tweet that out? If folks say things, will they tweet them?
I have a few books that I've ordered and I need to read before the summer is over. Black Software, The Internet and Racial Justice, From the AfroNet to Black Lives Matter. It's talking about how technology digital racial justice activism is the new civil rights movement. There's Automating Inequality, How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish the Poor. Have you read that, Kendra? Okay. So
it's really good. I really highly recommend Automating Inequality.
And then the last one is Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code.
I think I would add The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which talks a little bit about the history of the development of some of these data collection tools.
Eve, did you have one you were saying or typing?
I mean, I would recommend there's The Trials of Nina McCall, which is about sex work surveillance. And I think it's the decades-long government plan to imprison promiscuous women. I would also recommend, if you're interested in learning more about how public health is weaponized as surveillance against marginalized communities, Dorothy Roberts writes a lot of stuff about this. So yeah.
Everyone, if people want to be found online, or if you want to like lift up the work of the organizations that you work with, can you just shout out the @s?
You want me to just
at Hacking Hustling? It's really great. Sorry, Eves, go ahead.
You're fine. At Red Canary Song and at Survive Punish New York.
Awesome. Well, great. Thank you so much. We are slightly over time, so thank you so much to Cory, our transcriber, and for closed captioning, for sticking with us. I'm going to stop the live